What would you choose, a paycheck or the breath of a child? In July 2025, under the scorched sky of the Sahel, a silence fell. It wasn't peace, it was the silence after a storm. A storm not of bullets but of ink. That day, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did what no other West African leader had dared. He banned all non-biodegradable plastic. No compromise, no permission, just truth. By nightfall, 10,000 jobs were gone. Factories hushed, streets confused. But something else began to rise. The air changed. For the first time in decades, Ouagadougou didn't smell of melting waste. It smelled like rain. If this opening stirred something in you, don't scroll past. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning long overdue. It happened without warning. No televised speech, no press conference, just a signature and silence. On July 8, 2025, Burkina Faso became the first country in Africa to outlaw all non-biodegradable plastic. No exemptions, no delays. Plastic bags, wrappers, packaging, illegal. By sundown, over 200 factories had gone quiet. Headlines roared 10,000 jobs lost in a single day. Environmental courage or economic suicide. But the headlines missed something. The gutters no longer frothed with filth. The wind no longer carried poison. The nation had stopped coughing. And in that silence, something else began to breathe. Because what came next didn't come from policy. It came from the people. The morning after the plastic ban, the markets of Ouagadougou did not awaken with joy. They trembled. Vendors stood beneath faded umbrellas, not to sell, but to ask. How do we wrap food now? What keeps cassava dry in the rain? What replaces what kept our dignity together? No one answered. At a busy intersection in Koudougou, a man selling phone cards stared at the empty rack beside him. It had always been lined with single-use wrappers, once worthless, now illegal. He whispered, to no one in particular, they banned the plastic, but not the hunger. Children ran barefoot through alleyways that no longer shimmered with colorful nylon bags. But their joy was nervous. The smoke from the corner grills still rose, but the hands that turned maize over the flame were shaking. It wasn't chaos, it was confusion, not defiance but disbelief. In Bobo Dioulasso, factory gates were locked before sunrise. Workers arrived with tin lunchboxes, still hopeful. They stood in quiet lines, waiting, hoping someone would change the order. But the locks stayed cold, the managers stayed inside, and the machines, once thunderous, stood still like witnesses refusing to testify. One woman, mother of 5, turned and asked, "Do they expect us to eat the wind now?" But there were no cameras to capture her voice. No microphones waiting to record the aftermath, because the world only watched the ink, not the impact. And there lies the deeper truth. The backlash didn't come from the rich, not from corporations, not from ministers in tailored suits. It came from the poor, not because they wanted to poison the land, but because no one had offered them an alternative. No one had asked how a mother with no refrigerator keeps meat from rotting. No one had shown a street vendor how to wrap fried yam without plastic. For them, plastic was not pollution. It was protection. It covered what dignity couldn't. So when the ban came, it didn't feel like reform. It felt like punishment. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had warned them. His government had launched the Green Transition Initiative. Grants had been offered. Workshops were held. Machines subsidized. Training centers opened in regional towns. But many never came. Because the poor don't go where they've never been welcomed, because they had heard promises before, because in Burkina Faso, laws are made in the capital, but poverty is felt in the feet. One factory worker told a journalist, "We thought it was just talk, that he would blink, that Europe would call and stop the madness." But Traoré didn't blink, because his eyes weren't on Europe. They were on the children coughing behind stalls, on the grandmothers burning sandals to light a stove, on the canals where gutters had become graves. At a town hall in Toma, an elder stood up. Wrapped in indigo cotton, he spoke quietly. "I fought for independence in 1960, not to wrap my grandchildren's food in poison. If this is hard, let it be hard, but let it be honest." He sat down. The room did not clap. They nodded, because hardship is bearable, but silence is not. By the end of that first week, something changed. In Ouagadougou, a sanitation worker named Sambo noticed something strange. The gutters, once clogged with foam wrappers' filth, were flowing again. Children stopped coughing near the canals. Mosquitoes thinned. The breeze smelled different, not of burning trash, but of something older. Rain. For the first time in years, the city didn't fight the flood. The flood didn't come. And those who had cursed the ban began to watch the sky with different eyes. What if someone whispered, "We've forgotten what clean feels like"? If you were raised by someone who made something out of nothing, this story is yours too. Say her name out loud. Let her memory walk with this wind. They weren't protesting. They were remembering, not how to survive, but how to breathe. And in the back alley of a forgotten market, a girl, maybe 10, lifted a mango to her nose and said, "It doesn't smell like plastic anymore." That day, no minister smiled, no investor clapped, no press release was sent. But in the cracks of collapse, something more radical than reform was born. Memory. Fanta did not cry when the police took her plastic bags. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just stood beneath her frayed umbrella, surrounded by roasted maize and 3 quiet grandchildren, and asked the question. Then tell me, what do I feed them with now? My fingers. No one answered, because no one had answered her for 30 years. She had sold corn on that corner since before mobile phones, before electricity reached the streetlight above her. She had watched governments rise and fall. She had survived droughts, curfews, and debt, but nothing had ever taken her bags. The plastic had not just held food, it had held her routine, her rhythm, her reputation. Neighbors called her Yaba grandmother, not because she was old, but because she never missed a day. Through storms and soldiers, she was there with her charred tin bucket and maize perfectly turned. She knew the cost of forgetting, and now the country had remembered the sky but forgotten her hands. She tried paper. It melted. She tried wrapping with old newspaper. Customers complained the ink stained their clothes. One man shouted, "Am I buying food or propaganda?" So she began folding used cloth from the market dump, but it tore. Her fingers ached. And by the 3rd day, her youngest grandson developed a rash from reused fabric that had once held detergent. Fanta was not resisting change. She was just running out of ways to survive it. Then came the students. They arrived without cameras, without announcements, without pity. 3 of them barely older than her own children when they left for the capital. They wore rolled-up sleeves, eyes unafraid, and carried what looked like banana leaves and thread. One of them pointed to her empty corn stall and said gently, "We're not here to report you, ma'am. We're here to show you what our grandmothers used." Fanta raised an eyebrow. "Which grandmother?" she asked. "Because mine is buried with the knowledge I needed yesterday." They didn't laugh. They sat. On plastic crates and overturned buckets, they began to fold. Not with haste, but with reverence. One held up a palm leaf, another peeled strips from a stalk. The third hummed an old folk song while tying a perfect cone with dried grass string. Fanta watched. She had seen 1,000 styles of packaging, but never like this. One of them placed a cone in her hand and said, "Try it. Your fingers already know how." She touched the leaf. It was soft but firm, like the hands of a mother who had seen too much and still cooked every night. By sunset, she had folded 20 cones. By morning, she had taught 5 other women. By week's end, her corner of the market no longer looked poor. It looked ancient. It looked proud. The smell of roasted corn returned. So did the dignity. A woman who had never set foot in a university was now teaching food vendors how to bind cones without tearing the tips. Her umbrella no longer shaded just her stall, but half the street. People gathered not just to buy, but to learn. The market was not just adapting, it was remembering. A man from the city council arrived with a clipboard. He paused, looked around, then asked awkwardly, "Did someone train you?" Fanta stared at him. "Trained," she said. "No, I remembered." Then she pointed to the sky. And the soil remembered too. That's why the rain came. He didn't write that down, but he bowed slightly before walking away. Some said Fanta had been lucky, that the students found her by chance, but she knew better. She had lived long enough to understand chance is just the name people give to the work of ancestors. She didn't need charity, she needed respect. And when the students sat without offering solutions, only presence, she had found something she didn't know she was missing. Not packaging, not grants, not relief, but memory. of how hands used to move, of how food was wrapped in cloth and leaves, not because it was nostalgic, but because it was enough. In a corner of the market, once dismissed as irrelevant, a new rhythm was forming. Vendors swapped techniques the way others swap recipes. Scraps of cloth were repurposed with pride. Old newspapers became art. Daughters taught their mothers what the students had shown. Sons carried cones to school. Fanta became not just a vendor, but a keeper of knowledge. Not because she wrote it down, but because she passed it forward. Someone once asked her weeks later if she missed the plastic. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into a woven basket, pulled out a cone of maize tied with grass, and said, "This doesn't suffocate. Not the food, not the breath, not the future." Then she smiled and added, "And it costs nothing but remembering." If you have ever seen a woman stretch a meal for 5 mouths or turn waste into warmth, you already know this story. Say her name. Say your grandmother's name. Let her be remembered not for what she lacked, but for what she refused to forget. Madu had never known a world without plastic. To him, color meant survival. Black bags were for resale. Blue ones wrapped mangoes. Yellow could be traded for soap. Green burned his fingers. He knew which ones stung, which ones sparked, which ones choked slowly in the fire. He didn't go to school. He went to the dump. At the edge of the landfill in Fongorma, Madu worked like any child of the forgotten, quietly, barefoot. His mother had died of asthma, barely 100 meters from the smoke pile. His father had disappeared long before the ban. His only constants were the trucks, the ones that arrived before sunrise, heavy with what the city didn't want. Plastic for him was not pollution. It was promise. It held everything the world threw away, which meant everything he could sell. But then the trucks stopped. The day after the ban, the gates remained closed. 3 days passed. Same pile. No new bags. No colors to sort. No heat to harvest. And so Madu sat. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply folded into himself like the rappers he once knew so well. When the other children wandered off to beg or break into abandoned stalls, he stayed behind, guarding the pile as if it were his mother's grave. That was where she found him. Not an angel, not a teacher. A woman in rubber sandals and a sun hat too wide for her shoulders. She knelt not as an official, but as someone who remembered being barefoot herself. She didn't ask for his name. She asked, "Why are you still here?" Madu looked up, eyes cracked with dust, and said quietly, "Because this was the only thing that knew me." She did not take him to a shelter. She took him to a workshop. There were no desks, no blackboards, only buckets of pulp sheets of cassava fiber, and other children just like him picked from corners no one claimed. They were not taught spelling. They were taught to mold, to knead, to soak, to hold. And for the first time, Madu's hands held something that didn't burn. It didn't melt. It didn't cut his skin. It stayed. And something inside him did too. Within weeks, he could shape fiber into sheets. He learned to press with weight to dry without warping, to cut with symmetry. When asked why he worked so hard, he answered, "Because now my hands are known." And he wasn't just learning packaging, he was learning his own worth. 6 months later, his name appeared printed on a prototype food wrap. Simple, strong, biodegradable. The design with a folded edge to trap steam and a twist-lock top was not taught in any textbook. It came from the dump, from years of watching how wrappers bent, tore, failed. He had taken what once buried him and turned it into something that could breathe. Today, his wrap-stamped Madu 1 is used in 6 open-air markets, not as a token, as a standard. Fried yam stays hot, corn stays dry, food travels without shame, and every cone, every twist of the wrap is a quiet monument to a boy who once sorted waste for warmth. One reporter asked him, "What changed your life the most?" "The training." He shook his head. "No," he said, touching something that didn't hurt. At the National Expo for Green Innovation, Madu stood next to professors and engineers. He wore a second-hand shirt and sandals too small, but he spoke with clarity. "I was not rescued," he told the crowd. "I was included," and the room full of well-meaning experts fell quiet. Because Madu had revealed the one truth they had missed. Inclusion is not a policy. It's a practice, a daily one, and no document can replace what an open hand can begin. Today, Madu teaches, not in a classroom, but on the floor of the same workshop where he once sat. Children come in from the street, some barely tall enough to reach the table. He hands them fiber. He says nothing at first, just watches. then guides. Feel the pulp, he tells them. Let your fingers speak. And when they shape their first rap, he does not correct it. He celebrates it because he remembers what it felt like to hold the future for the first time and not drop it. If you've ever known the child whose name no one called, who watched trucks but not teachers, who learned survival before grammar, then you know Madu. You've met him in different skin, different cities, but his eyes are the same. Bright, cautious, waiting for someone to ask not just what he needs but what he remembers. Say his name now. Say Madu. Because a nation that once buried its children in waste now lets them shape what carries its food. And that is how revolutions begin. Not with speeches, but with small hands, holding gently and not letting go. No one expected the revolution to come from the corners. Not from parliaments or ministries, not from bankers or generals, but from a woman with cracked hands and a boy who once slept beneath melted bottles. Fanta never saw herself as a leader. She didn't give speeches. She didn't organize protests. She simply folded one palm leaf at a time every morning, every market day, until her cones wrapped more than food, they wrapped trust. Now vendors across 4 provinces follow her methods. She has no title, but they call her Yaba of the leaves. At 58, she is teaching 20-year-olds how to fold corners so they don't leak, how to tie without tearing, how to wrap without waste. And in every knot there is memory. And in every hand she holds there is the weight of something older than plastic tradition reborn. And Madu, he was supposed to vanish. The world had made room for his silence, not his voice. But silence once broken can echo louder than power. His rap design now reaches across 8 open-air markets. He trains children who were once scavengers like him. He refuses to be called rescued. He calls himself returned. At the National Youth Summit, someone asked what motivated him most. He said, "I want to be the last child who learns value in a landfill." The room applauded. But Madu didn't bow. He walked off stage and went home to finish teaching that day's class. The students who once taught Fanta, now they sit beside her learning. They bring fiber, she brings flame. They bring science, she brings time. Together they formed a collective. They don't call it a movement, but every week it grows. They share methods in WhatsApp groups. They meet in courtyards, not boardrooms. They name no leader, but follow one rule: if it doesn't reach the street, it's not real. The twist isn't that a policy succeeded. It's that the forgotten chose to remember. They remembered how to wrap food without harm, how to teach without permission, how to build without blueprints. And the government, it didn't direct this. It didn't plan it. It simply didn't stop it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré watched and then followed. He visited a banana leaf stall in person. He knelt beside Fanta and said, "You didn't resist, you responded, and that's harder." She didn't answer. She just handed him a corn cone. He held it carefully like a flag folded without crease. What began as backlash became blueprint. What began as loss became law. Not law of force, but law of return to hands, to soil, to things that don't need to be invented because they were never truly lost. And now when people speak of Burkina Faso, they do not speak of bans. They speak of breath. If you've ever been underestimated, told you were too small, too old, too poor to matter, remember this. The people no one counted on became the ones who couldn't be ignored. They didn't just adapt. They didn't just survive. They taught a nation to breathe again. The rain did not come with thunder. It came quietly, on a Tuesday, in the mid-afternoon, after weeks of silence. And when it fell, it did not flood. It soaked, it softened, it seeped into ground that had finally been cleared, not by machines, but by hands. Old men stood beside open gutters, watching water move like truth through a country that had finally stopped choking. Children danced. Women did not cheer. They nodded, as if to say, yes. This is what we remembered. No one held a parade. No one needed to. Because this was not a victory. This was a return to soil, to breath, to each other. And if your heart moved even a little while hearing this, then don't let this moment pass like mist. Speak it, share it, write it down for your grandchildren. Because healing too must be taught. If you believe in voices that rise from the ground, not from palaces, then subscribe now to Spirit of Africa. They hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud, together.